The mortar rounds came without warning. Thunder rolled across the ridgeline of Fort Ashen Hollow, and the ground itself seemed to buckle beneath the boots of soldiers who had spent the morning believing this outpost was too remote, too forgotten, too insignificant to ever see real combat. They were wrong. Smoke rose in black columns over the ammunition depot. Somewhere behind the collapsed perimeter fence, Staff Sergeant Marcus Delgado pressed himself against a shattered concrete barrier, blood running warm down the side of his face, and screamed the only question that mattered. Does anyone here know how to shoot long range? Does anyone here know how to actually hit something past 400 meters? Silence answered him, except it was not silence at all. It was gunfire and screaming and the wet crack of incoming rounds tearing through sandbags. But no human voice rose to meet his. His soldiers were riflemen, machine gunners, radio operators, cooks and mechanics pressed into a last stand they never trained for. Not one of them was a designated marksman, and the enemy advancing through the tree line below the depot moved with the terrifying discipline of men who had done this before. Then a voice, quiet, almost apologetic, spoke from behind a stack of crates near the maintenance shed. "I can shoot." Delgado turned. Crouched in the shadow of the depot's weapons locker was Specialist Nora Kessler, 24 years old, 5 months into her assignment, known to everyone on base as the quiet girl from Armory Maintenance, who cleaned rifles and filled out inventory logs and rarely spoke more than she had to. She was already moving before he could answer her, latching a long case that had sat beneath her cot for 5 months, a case everyone assumed held spare parts and cleaning kits. It did not. Inside, cradled in foam, was a modified M2010 enhanced sniper rifle, its stock scarred with use, its optics calibrated by hands that clearly knew exactly what they were doing. Delgado's mouth opened, then closed. "Where in the hell," he started to say, but Kessler was no longer looking at him. She was already sighting down the barrel, already breathing in that slow, measured rhythm of someone who had done this 1,000 times before. In places and under circumstances she had never once mentioned in 5 months of quiet mornings and quieter nights. The first shot she fired cracked across the valley like the end of the world. 700 meters downhill, an enemy sniper who had just begun to settle into a firing position among the rocks dropped without ever knowing what killed him. The soldiers nearest her stared. Corporal Priya Sandoval, 27, sharp-eyed and sharper-minded, had spent 5 months watching Kessler fold laundry-sized inventory sheets with the same tired precision as everyone else. Now she watched the woman work the bolt of a sniper rifle with fluid, unconscious grace, and something cold settled in her stomach. "That is not maintenance training," Sandoval murmured to no one in particular. "Nobody in this unit shoots like that." Kessler said nothing. She had already found her next target, an enemy fire team advancing along a drainage ditch 200 meters east, using the terrain exactly the way trained infantry would. She adjusted, breathed, fired. One man fell, the others scattered, suddenly aware they were not facing conscripts with rifles pointed in the general direction of danger. They were facing someone who saw everything. For nearly a minute, the battlefield reorganized itself around one fact. There was a shooter on the ridge who did not miss. Delgado crawled to her position, keeping his head below the sandbag line as rounds sparked off the metal roof above them. "Who are you?" he asked. And there was no anger in the question, only disbelief. Kessler's eye never left the scope. "Someone who can help, if you let me," she said. Another explosion rocked the depot's eastern wall. A young soldier screamed somewhere behind them, the sound cutting through the chaos like a blade. Delgado made his decision in half a second, the way command decisions are made when there is no time left for anything else. "Do it," he said. "Whatever you need, do it." She nodded once, and something in her changed. The quiet girl who filled out inventory forms and avoided eye contact in the mess hall was gone, replaced by someone else entirely. Someone whose stillness felt less like shyness and more like a coiled spring. She moved to a better firing position between two concrete barriers, checking sight lines with the eye of someone who had chosen positions like this before, in places far from Montana, in circumstance no one at Fort Ashen Hollow had clearance to imagine. Private Des Okafor, 22, barely 4 months out of basic training, watched her from behind an overturned supply cart, his young face pale with the kind of fear that came from realizing how close death actually was. He had joined the army to see the world, to make his mother proud, to become something more than the boy who grew up in a small apartment outside Baton Rouge. Nothing in his training had prepared him for artillery fire at 7 in the morning. Nothing had prepared him for watching a woman he barely knew calmly disassemble an enemy assault with a rifle that should not have existed in a maintenance shed. "Sergeant," Sandoval said, moving low to reach Delgado's position, ducking as a round cracked overhead. "Sergeant, who exactly did we let loose with a 50 caliber weapons system?" Delgado did not answer. He was watching Kessler work, watching the enemy's confident advance falter and stall against fire they could not locate, could not predict, could not survive. Kessler's fourth shot found an enemy radio operator attempting to coordinate the assault from behind a burned-out vehicle. "Command element compromised," she said quietly, her voice utterly flat, utterly professional, the voice of someone reciting a checklist rather than describing the death of a man 300 meters away. Delgado felt something cold move through him, the recognition that whatever Kessler had once been, she was not simply skilled. She was trained in a way that went beyond skill, trained the way only a very small number of soldiers in the entire military were ever trained. The enemy attack slowed, then stopped, then began to reorganize with visible caution. Whoever commanded them had clearly identified the threat and was recalculating. That gave Fort Ashen Hollow a window, and Delgado intended to use it. "Sandoval, get the wounded to the aid station. Okafor, resupply ammunition to the north wall. Move." His soldiers scattered to their tasks, and for a moment, an uneasy quiet settled over the depot, broken only by distant gunfire and the crackle of burning fuel somewhere near the vehicle yard. Kessler remained at her position, rifle steady, eyes scanning. Delgado crouched beside her. "You have 5 months in this unit," he said quietly. 5 months of paperwork and inventory counts, and you can do that." She kept her eye on the scope. "I had a life before this one," she said. "That is all you need to know right now." Delgado studied her profile, the calm set of her jaw, the stillness of her hands. "Fair enough," he said, "for now." But it would not stay fair for long, because barely 20 minutes later, Corporal Sandoval returned from the supply room with something that changed everything. She had gone to retrieve additional magazines from Kessler's gear, following standard resupply procedure, and in doing so had turned Kessler's rifle case over in the low light. Scratched faintly into the underside of the stock, nearly worn away by years of handling, were 2 letters, E and W. Sandoval said nothing to Kessler. She found Delgado instead, pulling him aside behind the medical tent while wounded soldiers were treated nearby, their groans mixing with the distant rumble of the enemy regrouping. "Sergeant," she said, her voice low and urgent, "there are initials carved into that rifle, EW." Delgado frowned. "So, soldiers mark their gear. It could mean anything." "It could," Sandoval said. "Except 3 years ago, during pre-deployment briefings, there was a single slide, one time only, about a classified marksmanship program that got shut down after an incident overseas. They never gave details, need to know only. But there was a name attached to it, a call sign, the widow." Delgado's stomach tightened. "You think Kessler?" "I think somebody handed a 24-year-old maintenance specialist a rifle worth more than this entire depot, and I think that somebody is dead now, or supposed to be," Sandoval said. "And I think we need to ask her who she really is before this goes any further." Before Delgado could respond, gunfire erupted again along the western tree line, sharper and closer than before. The enemy had regrouped and adjusted their approach, advancing now in smaller, more cautious teams, clearly wary of the sniper who had already cost them 4 men. Kessler's voice carried across the depot, calm despite the chaos. "Sergeant, they are flanking through the maintenance road. If they reach the vehicle bay, they will have direct line of sight to the ammunition bunker." Delgado moved without hesitation, calling orders, repositioning his remaining soldiers to cover the exposed flank. Kessler shifted her firing position without being told, anticipating the enemy's approach with an instinct that came from experience no maintenance technician could ever possess. She found her next target within seconds, a soldier attempting to set up a shoulder-fired rocket launcher aimed squarely at the depot's fuel storage. Kessler fired once. The man dropped before he could finish arming the weapon. "Rocket threat eliminated," she said, already scanning for the next. The battle continued in fractured bursts of violence and brief, unbearable silence. Each time the enemy attempted to advance, Kessler found the weak point in their formation and shattered it with surgical precision. Each time she fired, Delgado watched his soldiers glance toward her with a mixture of awe and unease, the sense that they had been protected by something they did not fully understand and were not entirely sure they wanted to. At one point, nearly 40 minutes into the engagement, an enemy fighter broke cover directly in front of Okafor's position, weapon raised, close enough that Okafor froze, unable to react fast enough to save himself. Kessler's shot came a half second before the enemy could fire, dropping him instantly. Okafor stood there afterwards, shaking, staring at the body 15 meters away, then turning to look at the ridge where Kessler knelt, invisible in the smoke, utterly still. "She saved my life," he said quietly to Sandoval, who had come to check on him. "I do not even know her, and she saved my life." Sandoval said nothing, though her eyes drifted toward the maintenance shed where Kessler's rifle case still lay open, initials facing skyward, unanswered questions gathering weight with every passing minute. It was nearly 2 hours into the assault when something happened that none of them expected, something that would linger far longer than the gunfire or the smoke. A group of enemy fighters retreating from Kessler's relentless fire had captured two depot support workers attempting to flee toward the motor pool. An older civilian contractor and a young private separated from his unit during the initial chaos. The fighters dragged them into the open near the collapsed fence line, using them as cover, positioning one man with a raised rifle, clearly preparing to execute the civilian in full view of the depot, a message meant to break morale. Kessler had a clean shot. Delgado saw it in the stillness of her posture, the readiness in her hands. "Take it," he said quietly. "Kill him." But Kessler did not fire immediately. She adjusted her aim by a fraction, waited exactly one breath longer than she needed to, and fired directly into the man's shoulder, shattering his weapon arm and sending him sprawling without killing him. The civilians scrambled free. The remaining fighters, startled by the unexpected mercy, retreated in confusion, dragging their wounded comrade with them. Delgado stared at her. "You had the kill shot," he said. "Why didn't you take it?" Kessler lowered her rifle slightly. Her jaw tightened, the first visible crack in her composure since the battle began. "Because I do not have to kill everyone who threatens me to win," she said quietly. "Sometimes the message matters more than the math." Delgado did not understand what she meant, not fully, but something in her voice told him this was not a philosophy she had arrived at easily. Something in her past had taught her that lesson at a price he could not yet imagine. Sandoval, standing nearby, exchanged a look with Delgado that needed no words. Whoever Nora Kessler truly was, she operated by rules that went far beyond simple survival, rules written by someone else, somewhere else, under circumstances none of them yet understood. The enemy assault finally broke apart entirely near the 3-hour mark, their coordinated attack dissolving into scattered retreat as reinforcement helicopters finally became audible in the distance. Still too far to have helped during the worst of it, but close enough now to matter. Kessler remained at her position long after the gunfire faded, scanning the tree line with the patience of someone who understood that battles rarely ended as cleanly as they seemed to. When Delgado finally approached her, the depot around them littered with debris and the exhausted, relieved faces of soldiers who had survived something they never expected to face. He found a folded scrap of paper tucked inside her rifle case, worn soft from handling, clearly read and reread many times before. He said nothing as she noticed him looking, but she did not hide it from him either. She held it out, just for a moment, just long enough for him to see the handwriting. "Hold 24 hours. 0 kills unless necessary. Trust the process." Delgado read it twice. "Whose orders are these?" he asked. Kessler folded the paper carefully and returned it to the case. "Someone I trust more than anyone alive," she said. "Or anyone I thought was alive." Delgado opened his mouth to press further, but something in her expression, a flicker of grief quickly suppressed, stopped him. There would be time for answers later. For now, there was only the exhausted quiet of survival and the uneasy knowledge that surviving had only been the beginning. That night, after the wounded had been stabilized and the perimeter reinforced with what few reserves remained, Kessler volunteered for first watch, a decision no one questioned given the day's events. She positioned herself near the depot's northern edge, rifle across her knees, eyes fixed on the ridge where she had made her first shot that morning. Sandoval found her there sometime after midnight, unable to sleep, still turning the day's revelations over in her mind. "Can I ask you something?" Sandoval said, settling nearby, keeping a respectful distance. Kessler did not look away from the ridge. "You are going to ask regardless of what I say." "Fair," Sandoval said. "The initials on your rifle, EW. Does that stand for someone named Whitfield?" For a long moment, Kessler said nothing at all, and the silence stretched long enough that Sandoval began to think she would not answer. Then quietly, almost too quiet to hear over the wind moving through the pines, Kessler spoke. She was the best marksman this country ever trained, and everyone who mattered was told she died 3 years ago. Sandoval's breath caught. Was. Kessler's eyes remained fixed on the darkness beyond the wire. "I do not know anymore," she said. "That is the problem. I do not know anything anymore, except that something about this depot does not add up, and I intend to find out what before I leave this mountain." Sandoval wanted to ask more, wanted to understand what exactly Kessler meant, but a sound from the depot's interior interrupted them, distant and mechanical, a low hum that had not been present before the battle. Kessler's head turned sharply toward it, every trace of exhaustion vanishing from her posture in an instant. "What is that?" Sandoval asked. Kessler was already moving, rifle in hand, following the sound toward the depot's oldest structure, a maintenance building. Everyone assumed had been sealed and empty for years, storage space for equipment no longer in service. They found the source near a rear access door, a ventilation system running where no ventilation system should exist. Humming steadily behind a wall marked only with faded stenciling, reading restricted, authorized personnel only. Kessler pressed her palm against the metal door, feeling the faint vibration beneath her fingers. And something shifted behind her eyes, some calculation clicking into place that Sandoval could not follow. "This is not a supply depot," Kessler said quietly, almost to herself. "This is not just weapons storage." Sandoval stared at the door, at the humming machinery behind it, at the woman beside her whose entire identity had unraveled in the span of a single day. "What are you talking about?" she asked. Kessler raised her scope toward a small vent opening near the top of the door, adjusting the thermal setting with practiced precision, and what she saw through it made her lower the rifle slowly, her expression unreadable in the darkness. "Rows of heat signatures," she said, her voice flat, controlled, the same voice she used when reporting kills earlier that day. "Human, behind a door that does not appear on a single blueprint this base was ever issued." Sandoval felt the cold reality of it settle over her like the mountain air itself. "Prisoners," she whispered. Kessler did not answer immediately, her eyes still fixed on the sealed door, on the secret buried beneath Fort Ashen Hollow that no one, not Delgado, not Command, not anyone she had met in 5 months of quiet mornings, had ever mentioned. "Whatever this base actually is," Kessler said finally, "it is not what we were told. And whoever is keeping this secret let an entire enemy assault happen this morning rather than risk anyone finding out." The humming behind the sealed door had not stopped by the time dawn broke over Fort Ashen Hollow, and neither had the questions it raised. Delgado stood at the depot's command post reviewing casualty reports, his uniform stiff with dried blood that was not his own, when Sandoval found him with news that made the previous day's battle feel almost simple by comparison. "Sergeant, we need to talk about Kessler," she said, "and about what she found behind the maintenance building last night." Delgado set down the clipboard in his hand. "Tell me." Sandoval explained what she had seen: the humming ventilation system, the door marked restricted, the thermal signatures Kessler had detected through a vent no wider than a mail slot. Delgado listened without interrupting, his jaw tightening with every detail. When she finished, he exhaled slowly. "That building has been locked since before I arrived here. Command told us it was decommissioned storage. Nothing more." Sandoval studied his face. "Do you believe that?" Delgado did not answer right away. "I did yesterday," he admitted. Across the depot, Sergeant First Class Gary Holloway sat hunched over his communications equipment, adjusting frequencies with the particular focus of a man who did not want to be interrupted. He had spent the morning reporting intermittent signal loss, static that came and went at inconvenient moments, moments that always seemed to align precisely with critical windows for requesting reinforcement. No one had thought much of it during the chaos of battle. Equipment failed under stress. But Delgado, walking past the communications tent, paused and watched Holloway for a moment longer than usual, filing the observation away without quite knowing why. Kessler had not slept. She remained near the sealed maintenance building through the early hours, studying the structure from every angle she could manage without drawing attention, calculating entry points, ventilation paths, structural weaknesses. When Okafor approached her with a cup of coffee, he had no memory of deciding to bring her. She accepted it with a small nod that was as close to gratitude as she seemed capable of showing. "You saved my life yesterday," he offered. "I never got the chance to thank you properly." Her eyes remained on the building. "You do not owe me thanks. You owe yourself the discipline to stay alive tomorrow. That is enough." Okafor studied her for a long moment. "Who taught you to talk like that?" he asked. Something flickered across her face, too fast to name. "Someone I spent 3 years mourning," she answered. Then she turned toward the command post, leaving the question hanging in the cold morning air. Delgado called a briefing an hour later, gathering his remaining squad leaders inside the command tent, the air thick with the smell of gun oil and old coffee. "We need to talk about what happened last night and what Specialist Kessler found," he began. Sandoval relayed the details again for the group, and Okafor, still shaken from the previous day, asked the question that had clearly been eating at him since morning. "Sergeant, why would this base hide prisoners? What kind of depot needs a secret holding cell?" Before anyone could answer, Holloway's voice cut through the tent from the communication station nearby. "Maybe it is not prisoners," he offered. "Maybe it is something classified we are not cleared to know. And maybe it is best we leave it alone before we get ourselves in trouble, poking around somewhere we should not be." His tone carried an edge sharper than the moment called for, defensive in a way that made Delgado glance toward him a second time. Sandoval noticed it too, filing it away the same way she had filed away the initials on Kessler's rifle stock the day before. Kessler said nothing during the briefing, standing near the tent's entrance with her arms crossed, listening more than speaking, the way she had done every day for 5 months before yesterday changed everything. But her mind worked through possibilities with the same cold precision she brought to calculating windage and bullet drop. Something about Holloway's insistence to leave the matter alone sat wrong with her, the same wrongness she had learned to trust years before this deployment, in circumstances she had spent 3 years trying not to think about. The enemy did not wait long to test the depot's weakened defenses again. By mid-morning, scouts reported a second wave assembling in the valley below, larger than the first, better equipped, moving with the kind of coordinated caution that suggested they had studied yesterday's failure and adjusted accordingly. Delgado gathered his forces along the eastern ridge, positioning Kessler at the highest point available, a crumbling observation post that had clearly seen combat decades before any of them were born. From her position, Kessler watched the enemy formation through her scope, counting weapons, estimating numbers, calculating angles of approach with the fluency of someone reading a familiar language. "They know I am here," she told Delgado, who had joined her at the post despite the exposed position. "They are moving slower this time, more careful. That means they lost someone important yesterday." Delgado studied the distant tree line through his binoculars. "Can you hold them?" She adjusted her scope without looking away. "I can make them bleed for every meter they take," she answered. "Whether that is enough depends on how much they are willing to lose." The first shots of the second assault came almost gently by comparison, probing fire testing the depot's response before committing to a full advance. Kessler answered each probe with lethal efficiency, dropping an advanced scout at 600 meters, then a second attempting to flank through a drainage culvert. Each shot fired with the same unhurried precision, each kill confirmed in the same flat professional register that unsettled everyone within earshot. 20 minutes into the engagement, Kessler noticed something through her scope that made her entire body go still. A narrow gap between two collapsed sections of the depot's outer wall, barely visible unless the light hit it exactly right, framed an enemy machine gun position she had not accounted for in her earlier assessment. She fired through the gap without hesitation, the round threading a path no wider than a doorway. The weapon fell silent. It was the kind of shot that should have required minutes of calculation and instead took her less than 3 heartbeats, muscle memory built from years of training reasserting itself in the heat of combat. Delgado watched the shot land and said nothing for a long moment. Then, almost to himself, he murmured, "Whoever trained you built something the rest of us are not meant to understand." She did not respond. She was already moving to a new firing position, disappearing into the drifting smoke without a word of explanation. At the command post, Sandoval was staring at a printout Holloway had reluctantly handed over, records of communication attempts to battalion headquarters over the past 18 hours. Something about the pattern bothered her immediately, gaps that occurred not randomly, as equipment failure would suggest, but at precise intervals, always during windows when reinforcement requests would have carried the most weight. "She is not going to like this," Sandoval murmured, already moving to find Delgado, unaware that the man she needed was pinned down near the ridge, watching his depot's fate hang on the aim of a woman he had known for less than 2 days and trusted more than he had trusted anyone in years. Kessler's new position gave her a clear line on the enemy's rear elements, and what she saw there made her breath catch, just slightly. A group of fighters moving portable jamming equipment toward the depot's rear, the kind used specifically to disrupt communications during a coordinated assault. "They are not just attacking," she reported into her radio, her voice tight with a new kind of urgency. "They are trying to isolate this base completely." Completely, Delgado's voice crackled back, distorted by static. "Copy that. Can you reach it?" She was already calculating the shot, distance, wind, the narrow window of exposure the operators presented. 600 meters, she said. "Moving targets, partial cover. I can try." She settled her breathing, found her rhythm, and fired twice in quick succession. Both operators dropped before the equipment could power on. "Jamming threat eliminated," she reported. But even as she said it, something nagged at the edge of her awareness. The jamming equipment had been positioned with unusual precision, aimed not at the depot's main communication tower, but specifically at a secondary relay near the maintenance building. It was not a coincidence. Someone wanted that specific signal cut. The pieces locked into place slowly. Holloway's persistent signal loss, the timing of his equipment failures, his insistence that the base's secrets be left alone. Each detail alone meant nothing. Together they painted a picture she did not want to see. A distant crack of gunfire interrupted her thoughts. Closer now, sharper, the sound of the enemy's main assault beginning in earnest, and she forced the suspicion into a quiet corner of her mind to be examined later. The enemy advanced in 3 coordinated teams, using the terrain with the same discipline they had shown the previous day. Kessler worked methodically through the threat, dropping a squad leader here, a heavy weapons operator there, each shot buying Delgado's exhausted soldiers precious seconds. Sandoval, back at the command post, tried desperately to reach Delgado through the failing radio system, her warning about the communication logs growing more urgent with every static-filled attempt. It was during a lull in the fighting, barely 90 seconds of relative quiet as the enemy regrouped, that Kessler allowed herself a single moment of stillness, her rifle resting across her knees, her eyes closed against the smoke drifting across the ridge. A sound reached her, the distant metallic clack of a rifle bolt, drawn back somewhere below, and her mind slipped backward before she could stop it. She remembered a rooftop overseas, 3 years earlier, Elaine Whitfield beside her, both of them holding overwatch for an extraction team moving through a market district at dusk. Whitfield had spotted a threat first, a man positioned on a balcony with a rifle angled toward the extraction route. She called it in immediately, but the target sat 2 buildings from a structure flagged as possibly occupied by civilians. And protocol demanded the call, travel up through the operations officer and then to the legal officer attached to the mission before any shot could be authorized. Whitfield waited because Whitfield always followed the chain when the chain existed for a reason. The authorization came back 43 minutes later, forwarded through a channel that had been quietly compromised for weeks by people neither of them yet knew existed. Arriving after the shooter had already fired on the extraction team and repositioned to target Whitfield's own overwatch position. Kessler had taken the shot that killed him, but Whitfield was already down, and the years since had taught Kessler that some silences in a radio channel are not caused by distance or terrain. They are caused by someone, somewhere, deciding a delay served them better than the truth. The memory lasted only a few seconds, but its weight settled into her chest like something physical. When she opened her eyes again, her hands were already moving, repositioning her rifle without waiting for orders, without waiting for confirmation through any channel at all. She would not wait for a compromised silence to clear again, not for anyone. The enemy's third assault came faster than the previous two, a coordinated push meant to overwhelm the depot's remaining defenders before Kessler could adjust to their new positioning. She met it without hesitation, moving between firing positions with a fluidity that left Okafor watching from the perimeter, genuinely uncertain whether he was witnessing combat or something closer to choreography. It was in the middle of this exchange that Sandoval finally reached Delgado directly, abandoning the radio entirely and sprinting across open ground under covering fire. "Sergeant," she gasped, dropping beside him, "the communication failures. They are not random. Someone is timing them." Delgado's face hardened. "Holloway," he said, the name landing like an accusation neither of them wanted to voice aloud. Before Delgado could respond, a runner arrived with news that changed the calculus of the entire battle. The enemy had begun moving heavier equipment forward. Portable rocket systems capable of striking targets well beyond the range of standard infantry weapons. If those systems became operational, no position on the ridge would remain safe, including Kessler's. Kessler received the warning through a runner sent by Okafor, her radio channel compromised. She absorbed the information without visible reaction, already calculating the new threat's position. 800 meters, she estimated, moving to a new angle. Extreme range, poor visibility, moving targets. She took the shot anyway, 3 rounds fired in careful succession across nearly 10 seconds. 2 found their mark. The rocket system remained intact but unmanned, its threat neutralized for the moment. The enemy's advance finally stalled entirely near the 3-hour mark. It was during the reorganization that followed that Holloway made his mistake. Believing the chaos of battle provided sufficient cover, he attempted to transmit a brief encrypted signal from a secondary device hidden within his equipment case, a transmission Sandoval intercepted almost by accident while attempting to repair the primary communication array. She said nothing initially, copying the frequency and timing before approaching Delgado with evidence too specific to dismiss as coincidence. "Sergeant," she said quietly, pulling him aside, "Holloway just sent something, not to battalion, to somewhere else entirely." What Sandoval revealed over the following minutes painted a picture darker than either of them had anticipated. Holloway had not simply failed to relay critical communications. He had actively been selling information about the depot's defenses to the very forces attacking them, motivated by debts that had apparently grown too large to manage through legitimate means. Delgado's hands tightened into fists. "Get him," he said, "now." But before Sandoval could move, gunfire erupted from an unexpected direction, forcing everyone back into defensive positions. Holloway, sensing his exposure had grown too dangerous to manage quietly, slipped away from the command post during the confusion, disappearing toward the depot's rear sections where the sealed maintenance building stood silent and waiting. Kessler, watching the depot's interior through her scope from the ridge, caught sight of Holloway's movement immediately. "Sergeant," she said into her radio, ignoring the static, "your communications specialist is heading toward the sealed building. He knows something about it." Delgado's response came back garbled, but the fragments she caught confirmed what she already suspected. Confirmed, "Do not let him." Kessler was already moving before the transmission finished, descending toward the depot at a pace that would have seemed reckless from anyone without her training. She reached the maintenance building's perimeter just as Holloway produced a key card from his uniform, a key card that should not have existed for a building supposedly decommissioned years earlier. He turned as she approached, his expression shifting rapidly from surprise to something colder. "You should not be here," he said. "This is above your clearance." Kessler kept her rifle level, though not aimed directly at him. "Everything about this base is above someone's clearance," she answered, "including whatever you have been selling to the people trying to kill us." Holloway's jaw tightened. "You do not understand what is really happening here." "Then explain it to me," she said. "Right now." For a moment, something flickered across his face. Not quite guilt, but something adjacent to it. "There is a secret they do not want getting out," he said finally, his voice tight with something between desperation and defiance. "Something in that building that could end careers. I am not the villain here. I am just someone who found a way to survive what was coming." Before Kessler could press further, The keycard activated the door's mechanism, and something inside shifted audibly, a heavy locking system disengaging. Holloway had clearly decided the moment for secrecy had passed. The door swung open, revealing a narrow corridor lit by emergency lighting, descending at an angle that suggested the facility extended far deeper than anyone at Fort Ashen Hollow had ever imagined. Kessler's breath caught as the thermal signatures she had detected through the ventilation shaft the previous night became visible ahead, human shapes moving weakly in the dim emergency light. Holloway stepped into the corridor entrance, turning back toward her with an expression that had hardened into something resembling resolve. "You want the truth," he said. "Fine, there is a federal investigator being held in this facility, and a woman everyone above your clearance believes is either dead or an acceptable loss. Both of them got too close to a weapons trafficking network that reaches higher than anyone at this depot is authorized to know about. This facility has moved between 3 different holding sites over the last 3 years as the network relocated its operations. It ended up here 8 months ago when this depot was quietly repurposed to absorb what used to be a much smaller regional storage site. The investigator arrived 4 months ago after his own operation collapsed. Someone decided containing that information mattered more than following proper channels. I just found a way to profit from a secret that already existed before I ever got assigned here." Kessler's grip tightened on her rifle, the pieces of the past 2 days arranging themselves into a picture darker and more complicated than she had anticipated. The zero-kill order suddenly made devastating sense, a directive not born from mercy alone, but from the desperate need to avoid triggering violence that might expose or endanger the people hidden below. And the timeline at last made sense as well. 3 years since she had believed Whitfield died. 8 months since this depot became the place where that lie was quietly maintained. 4 months since a second life became tangled in the same silence. Behind Kessler, the sound of approaching footsteps announced Sandoval's arrival. Breathless from the run across the depot, her weapon raised. Delgado followed close behind, his face carrying the particular fury of a commander who had just learned his own unit harbored betrayal from within. "Holloway," he said, his voice carrying a warning that needed no further explanation. "Step away from that door, right now." But Holloway did not move, his eyes darting between the three of them, with the calculating desperation of a man who understood his choices had narrowed to almost nothing. "You do not understand what happens if this gets out," he said, his voice rising. "Everyone connected to this operation gets buried. I have debts that never go away no matter how this ends. The only way I walk away is if that door closes again and everyone forgets what is behind it." Kessler's voice, when she spoke, carried the same flat, unshakable calm she had used throughout the battle. "That door is not closing," she said, "and you are not walking away from this." Holloway's hand moved toward the weapon at his side, the motion small but unmistakable. Before he could complete it, the ground beneath all of them shuddered violently, an explosion somewhere near the depot's perimeter, shaking dust from the corridor ceiling. The enemy's second wave, apparently regrouped and reinforced, had resumed their assault with renewed intensity, timing their attack with an awareness that suggested Holloway's earlier transmission had done exactly the damage everyone feared. "They know we found out!" Sandoval shouted over the rising chaos. "They are trying to finish this before we can expose anything." Delgado's expression hardened into the particular focus of a commander facing an impossible convergence of crises. Kessler moved first, her decision made before anyone else had finished processing the scope of what was happening. "Get him restrained," she said, gesturing toward Holloway. "I am going down there." Delgado hesitated only a moment before nodding. "Go," he said. "We will hold the line as long as we can." As Kessler descended into the corridor, rifle ready, she became aware of a sound she had not expected. A voice, weak but unmistakable, calling out from somewhere deeper in the facility, a voice she recognized instantly despite 3 years of believing she would never hear it again. "Nora," the voice called, hoarse and strained. "Is that you?" Kessler's breath stopped entirely, her rifle nearly slipping from hands that had remained perfectly steady through hours of combat, but now trembled at the sound of a voice she had buried alongside 3 years of grief and guilt. She had spent every day since believing Elaine Whitfield died because a compromised channel took 43 minutes to answer a call that should never have needed answering at all. She had not been gone. She had been moved, hidden, kept alive or barely alive through circumstances that made no sense yet and would take everything Kessler had left to fully understand. Above them, the depot shook again under renewed bombardment, the enemy's second wave pressing forward with a desperation that suggested this was no longer simply about the weapons depot's contents, but about ensuring nothing that happened here today would ever see daylight. Somewhere in that chaos, Delgado fought to hold a collapsing perimeter with soldiers who had already given everything they had. Somewhere behind her, Holloway remained a threat not yet fully contained, and somewhere ahead, in the darkness of a facility that officially did not exist, Elaine Whitfield waited, alive after 3 years of believing she was dead, her voice carrying a question that would reshape everything Kessler thought she understood about the mission she had been sent to complete. Kessler moved deeper into the corridor, her rifle steady despite everything trembling beneath the surface of her composure. And somewhere above her, the sound of the depot's remaining defenses began, unmistakably, to fail. The corridor swallowed the sound of the battle above almost entirely, replacing gunfire and explosions with something quieter and far more unsettling. The hum of failing emergency systems and the ragged breathing of a voice Kessler had spent 3 years believing she would never hear again. She moved forward with her rifle raised, every instinct honed through years of training, screaming at her to proceed with caution, even as something deeper urged her to run. "Nora," the voice called again, weaker this time. "Is that really you?" Kessler rounded the final corner and stopped. In a reinforced holding cell barely large enough for a cot and a metal chair. Chained to the wall by restraints clearly meant for someone far more dangerous than the frail figure they now confined, sat Elaine Whitfield, 3 years older than the last time Kessler had seen her hair fully gray now, a long scar tracing her jaw that had not existed before, but unmistakably alive. Kessler's rifle lowered slowly, her hands finally betraying the composure she had maintained through hours of combat. "They told me you were dead," Kessler whispered. "I stood at a memorial with your name on it. I carried that for 3 years." Whitfield's eyes, sunken but sharp, studied her former student with something between relief and sorrow. "He needed everyone to believe that," she said, her voice raw from disuse, "including you. I was moved twice in those 3 years, further each time from anyone who might have recognized me, until this depot absorbed the smaller site where they were keeping me. Grief made better cover than any lie ever could, and I let it, because I did not know if telling you the truth would put you in the same cell." Kessler moved to the cell door, examining the lock with the same focused precision she brought to calculating a difficult shot. It was electronic, requiring a code she did not have, reinforced far beyond what any standard depot facility should possess. Somewhere down the corridor, a second cell held another figure, silent and watchful. A man whose posture, despite obvious exhaustion, carried the unmistakable bearing of federal law enforcement rather than military service. "Special Agent Wesley Trent," the man said quietly, introducing himself through the bars of his own cell. 3 years investigating a weapons trafficking network that used facilities like this one for distribution. Whitfield found the operation independently, long before I did. When she got too close, they moved her rather than eliminated her, insurance in case they needed information later. I got captured trying to trace where she had been taken 4 months ago. We have been leverage against each other's silence ever since. Kessler's mind worked rapidly through the implications, the zero-kill order finally crystallizing into complete sense. Someone within the chain of command had known about this operation, had known Whitfield and Trent were held here, and had ensured that any combat at this depot avoided triggering a response that might result in their deaths or discovery. "I need the access code," she said, already scanning the cell block for any control panel or override system. Whitfield shook her head slowly, wincing at the effort. "There is no code I have access to," she said. "The system is tied to the depot's central communications array. Whoever controls that controls this door." The realization landed heavily. Holloway, whatever he had done to the communication systems over the past 2 days, it had all been in service of maintaining control over exactly this mechanism. Above them, the depot shuddered under renewed bombardment, dust falling from the corridor ceiling in a steady rain. Kessler's radio crackled with fragments of Delgado's voice, barely audible through the interference. "Perimeter failing," she caught. "North wall breached. Need everyone topside now. Whitfield's hand, thin and trembling, reached through the bars to grip Kessler's wrist with surprising strength. Listen to me, she said, her voice suddenly sharp with urgency despite her physical weakness. Do not focus on getting us out first. There are files in this facility, evidence Trent and I have spent months compiling, documentation that exposes the entire trafficking network and everyone within command who allowed it to continue. If this building falls before that evidence is secured, everything we suffered here means nothing. Kessler stared at her former mentor, something cold settling in her chest. You are telling me to prioritize paperwork over your life. Whitfield's expression did not waver. I am telling you that some things matter more than any single life, including mine, she said. You already learned that once, the hard way. Do not let me watch you forget it now, when it actually matters. Trent spoke from his own cell, his voice steady despite obvious exhaustion. The evidence room is 2 doors down, he said. Locked, but not electronically. A physical vault, the kind these facilities used before everything went digital. If you can get through that door, everything we need is inside. Kessler made her decision in the span of a single breath. She moved to the vault door Trent indicated, examining the mechanism with the same analytical focus she brought to every problem the mission presented. It was old, mechanical, the kind of lock that depended on precise manipulation rather than brute force. Her hands worked quickly, translating skills learned years ago in a completely different context toward this unexpected application. The vault door gave way after nearly 90 seconds of careful work, revealing shelves of documentation, photographs, financial records, and recorded testimony that represented months of dangerous investigation compressed into physical evidence that could dismantle an entire criminal network reaching disturbingly high into positions of trust. Above them, the sound of the battle grew more desperate. Kessler gathered what evidence she could carry, stuffing documents into a canvas bag she found discarded nearby, aware that every second spent here was a second the depot's remaining defenders fought without her support. It was as she finished securing the last of the files that Holloway appeared at the corridor entrance, his weapon raised, his expression carrying the particular desperation of a man who understood his options had narrowed to violence or complete ruin. Behind him, restrained but clearly forced forward at gunpoint, stood Sandoval, her hands bound, her expression carrying more fury than fear. Do not move, Holloway said, his voice tight with barely controlled panic. Put down whatever you took from that vault, or I put a bullet in her right now. Kessler's hands stilled, the bag of evidence held loosely at her side, her mind already calculating angles and distances. Sandoval's eyes met hers across the corridor, carrying a message that needed no words. You do not want to do this, Kessler said. Whatever debts drove you here, killing a fellow soldier does not solve them. It only makes everything worse. Holloway's grip on his weapon tightened, his eyes darting between Kessler and the evidence bag. You do not understand, he said, his voice cracking slightly. If that evidence gets out, I lose everything. My career, my freedom, maybe my life, if the people I owe decide I have become a liability instead of an asset. Trent spoke from his cell, his voice carrying the calm authority of someone who had spent months navigating exactly this kind of desperate calculation. It already got out the moment she found this facility. Holloway, he said, the only choice you have left is whether you make things worse for yourself or not. Holloway's composure fractured visibly, his weapon wavering between targets. Kessler watched the shift in his posture, the narrow window it created, and understood she had perhaps 2 seconds to act before his desperation curdled into something irreversible. She moved without announcing the decision, drawing her sidearm in a motion so fast that Holloway barely registered the movement before her round found the narrow gap between his shoulder and Sandoval's restrained arms, striking his weapon hand with surgical precision that dropped his gun without touching Sandoval at all. I trust what I see, she thought, the words surfacing from somewhere deep in memory. Whitfield's own lesson finally understood completely. Not what I am told to wait for. Holloway crumpled against the corridor wall, clutching his ruined hand. Sandoval moved quickly despite her bound hands, kicking his weapon further away before turning to Kessler with an expression that mixed relief and something close to awe. That shot, she started to say. Kessler was already moving to free her restraints. Explanations later, she said. Right now, we need to get everyone out of this building before it comes down around us. Above them, the depot's remaining defenses had clearly reached a breaking point. Delgado's voice, when it finally crackled through the radio with enough clarity to understand, carried the particular strain of a commander watching his position collapse. Kessler, wherever you are, we need everything you have got. North Wall is gone. We cannot hold much longer. Kessler freed Whitfield and Trent from their cells, moving with efficient urgency now that time had become the most valuable resource remaining. Whitfield struggled to stand, months of captivity clearly having taken a toll far beyond what her voice alone suggested, but she waved away Kessler's attempt to support her fully. I can walk, she said, though her voice carried more determination than certainty. Get topside. Your soldiers need you more than I do right now. The climb back through the corridor felt endless, every step accompanied by the growing intensity of battle sounds from above, until they finally emerged into daylight that revealed a scene of devastating chaos. The depot's northern perimeter had indeed collapsed, enemy fighters pushing through the breach with a determination that suggested they understood this represented their final opportunity to seize what remained of the facility before reinforcements could possibly arrive. Delgado fought at the center of a rapidly contracting defensive line, his remaining soldiers exhausted but refusing to break. Okafor, blood streaming from a shallow wound along his forearm, continued firing with the desperate focus of someone who had learned through this battle exactly what courage actually required. Kessler took in the scene in a single assessment, her mind already calculating the most effective way to shift the battle's momentum. She moved to the highest available position, a partially collapsed guard tower that offered visibility across the entire breach despite obvious structural instability, and began working through targets with the same relentless precision that had defined every moment since this battle began. Whitfield, despite months of captivity, positioned herself near the tower's base, directing fire coordination with a clarity that suggested her tactical mind remained as sharp as ever, even as her body struggled to keep pace. The enemy, sensing their advantage slipping away, committed their remaining forces to a final desperate push. Kessler met their assault with everything her training had ever taught her, working through targets with a speed and precision that left even Delgado, who had witnessed her skill across 2 days of combat, genuinely amazed. It was in the middle of this final exchange that the sound every soldier at Fort Ashen Hollow had been desperately hoping for finally arrived. The distant rotor wash of reinforcement helicopters closing rapidly from the east, followed within minutes by the arrival of a full company of federal tactical support. Drawn by emergency signals, Sandoval had managed to transmit once she freed herself from the compromised communication systems Holloway had controlled. The enemy's final assault collapsed entirely under the combined weight of Kessler's precision fire and the sudden arrival of overwhelming reinforcement, their remaining fighters scattering into retreat. Within 20 minutes, Fort Ashen Hollow's perimeter had stabilized completely, federal forces securing the depot's exterior, while medical teams began treating the wounded who had fought so desperately to hold their position. Kessler descended from the tower slowly, the adrenaline that had sustained her through 2 days of continuous combat finally beginning to drain away. Delgado approached her amid the settling chaos, his uniform torn and bloodied, but his expression carrying profound relief. You held this depot together, he said. Twice. Kessler shook her head slightly. We held it together, she corrected, all of us. Delgado's gaze drifted toward Whitfield, who stood nearby being examined by medical personnel, despite her protest that the evidence mattered more than her condition. And her, he said, the woman everyone believed was dead. Kessler followed his gaze, something complicated moving across her expression. My teacher, she said. The person who taught me everything I know about this work and about the weight that comes with it. In the hours that followed, as federal investigators began processing the depot and securing the evidence, Trent and Whitfield had risked everything to compile. The full scope of the conspiracy that had led to this battle became clear. Holloway, restrained and awaiting transport to federal custody, had indeed been selling information to the weapons trafficking network for months, his debts finally forcing him into a betrayal that had nearly cost every soldier at Fort Ashen Hollow their lives. The network itself, according to evidence, Whitfield and Trent had compiled during months of dangerous investigation, extended into positions of authority far higher than anyone at the depot had clearance to fully understand, connections that federal prosecutors would spend months, if not years, untangling. Whitfield, recovering slowly under medical supervision, finally had the conversation with Kessler that 3 years of separation and false grief had prevented. They sat together near the depot's medical tent as evening settled over the mountains, the chaos of battle finally giving way to the quiet exhaustion of survival. "I need you to understand something," Whitfield said, her voice still weak but steadier than it had been in the tunnel below. "What happened 3 years ago was not your failure. The channel that delayed our authorization had already been compromised by people connected to this same network, long before either of us knew this operation existed. You did not hesitate. You were failed by a system someone else had already broken." Kessler absorbed this slowly, 3 years of carefully constructed guilt shifting beneath the weight of this revelation. "I built my whole sense of failure around a moment that was never mine to carry," she said quietly. Whitfield's expression carried genuine understanding. "Then let this be the moment you finally set it down," she said. Kessler considered this for a long moment, watching the last light fade behind the mountains that had witnessed 2 days of combat few would ever fully understand. "I am not angry," she said finally, and found the words were true even as she spoke them. "I am grateful you are alive. Everything else we can work through with time." The following morning, as Fort Ashen Hollow settled into the uneasy quiet of aftermath, Delgado found Kessler standing near the maintenance building, where this entire ordeal had begun, staring at the now open door that had concealed so much for so long. "Command wants you back," he said, approaching with a folder tucked under his arm. "Full reinstatement to the marksmanship program, given everything that happened here. Your choice of assignment, apparently." Kessler studied the folder without immediately reaching for it. "And if I refuse?" Delgado shrugged slightly. "Then they respect that. But something tells me you are not the kind of person who walks away from this work entirely. Not anymore." Kessler considered the offer, weighing 3 years of hiding within the anonymity of maintenance duties against everything she had rediscovered about herself during this battle. "I will take the assignment," she said finally. "But I want to train the next generation, not simply return to field operations alone. Whitfield taught me that trusting what you see matters more than waiting for permission to believe it. I want whoever carries a rifle after me to learn that from the start, rather than learning it the way I did." Delgado nodded slowly, something like respect settling into his expression. "That seems like exactly the kind of choice Fort Ashen Hollow needed someone like you to make," he said. Before he turned to leave, he paused. "Why did you stay behind that first day?" he asked, "when you could have stayed hidden as maintenance staff and let someone else take the risk?" Kessler considered the question carefully. "Because I was tired of trusting silence over instinct," she said quietly. "Today, I trusted what I saw. That mattered more than staying hidden ever could." In the days that followed, Kessler found herself standing once more before the maintenance shed where this entire ordeal had begun. Her rifle case opened before her, the modified stock catching the late afternoon light. She retrieved a small engraving tool, working carefully along the weapon stock beneath Whitfield's original initials, adding 4 words that captured everything this battle had taught her. Not late, not lost. She closed the case slowly, the words settling into the wood alongside the legacy that had shaped her. Whitfield and Trent departed for extended medical care and debriefing 3 days later. The evidence they had risked everything to preserve already, beginning to unravel a conspiracy that would take federal investigators months to fully dismantle. Sandoval approached Kessler on the depot's edge as the transport vehicles prepared to leave, her expression carrying the particular respect of someone who had witnessed something extraordinary. "I still do not fully understand everything that happened here," Sandoval admitted, "but I understand this depot survived because of you, twice, in ways none of us were prepared for." Kessler offered the smallest hint of a smile. "Sometimes surviving is not about understanding everything," she said. "Sometimes it is simply about trusting what is in front of you, exactly when it matters most." As the transport vehicles disappeared down the mountain road, Delgado stood beside Kessler watching the dust settle across the valley below. Holloway's fate remained uncertain, federal custody awaiting formal charges that would likely keep him confined for years to come, though rumors already circulated about the extent of the network he had served and whether all its members had truly been identified. "There is still a question that bothers me," Delgado admitted, as evening settled once more over the mountains. Holloway kept insisting there were others involved, people higher up who orchestrated all of this. Do you think we actually caught everyone responsible? Kessler's eyes remained fixed on the darkening tree line. I think some questions do not get answered as quickly as we would like, she said slowly. And I think whoever else was involved in this network is probably watching very carefully to see what happens next. Somewhere in a federal holding facility hundreds of miles away, in a transport vehicle carrying Gary Holloway toward formal charges, he would likely never fully escape. A brief and unexplained mechanical failure delayed the convoy for exactly 11 minutes along a stretch of highway with no surveillance cameras and no witnesses. When the convoy resumed its journey, everything appeared normal, the paperwork complete, the prisoner accounted for. It would be nearly 3 weeks before anyone noticed that the man delivered to federal custody that evening, though matching every physical description on record, never spoke another word about the network he claimed reached higher than anyone at Fort Ashen Hollow had ever been authorized to know.